Well, today today is a day where we talk to our families about politics. A lot of us talk to our families about politics around the Christmas table, and we're going to learn how we're going to do that correctly today from Ashley Virtue, who is the Director of External Relations at the National Conflict Resolution Center. Merry Christmas, Ashley, and good morning.
Hi, good morning. Merry Christmas to you too.
Now, tell us first, what is the National Conflict Resolution Center?
Well, if you can't tell from our name at the National Conflict Resolution Center, we really deal in this idea of conflict. We really are comfortable in it. We work in it day in and day out. But the flip side of dealing with conflict is that we also are dealing a lot in conflict resolution, in the positive side of conflict, and we really do believe that there is a civil way to disagree with one another. And when equipped with some of the right communication tools, and you're able to do that, you can have really constructive and healthy conversations. So, what we do at the National Conflict Resolution Center is really work to equip people with those tools so they can have those conversations, have those dialogue.
So, what do you think is the current state of the political discourse in this country?
We have stepped very far away from, I think, healthy discourse. We right now live in a state in our country where I think people do one of two things. I think they either avoid conflict completely, so they have ruled out having the conversations. They just would prefer not to see the people they disagree with, not to engage in those conversations, or people have gone into attack mode where we have completely villainized anyone who has views that are different than ours. And, unfortunately, I think we see that permeating throughout the country. I think we see that in the government. I also think that we see it in schools, in universities, sometimes in workplaces. And so while all of that sounds very negative, I think there really is an opportunity and a new chapter ahead where people will be more engaged in civil discourse, because really what we're seeing at this point is that this contentious notion of fighting and attacking each other, as well as this idea of just avoiding it altogether, is not getting us where we need to be as a country. We have to return to having sometimes difficult but important conversations.
Now, it makes it sound like you think that the conversations and the discourse now is worse than what it used to be. Am I understanding that your position, that it's now our political discourse is now worse than it used to be?
I do think that it has become worse over the years. I do think we've lost sight a little bit on the idea that there is a healthy way to disagree with one another.
Now, do you think that the cause of this loss of political discourse is the media? Is it social media? Is it politics? What's causing this reversion in political discourse?
I don't think we can point to any one thing. I think that it has happened over time, over years, really. Really, what I think it starts with is our children. So if we are exemplifying to them, say this Christmas today, over the holiday table, you have children at the table, and let's say that we're exemplifying that, oh, Uncle so and so can't talk to Aunt so and so because they fight over, this political issue, or, mom, hides and leaves the room every time grandpa brings up how he voted or something. What we're showing them is that this is nerve-wracking. This is not a fun conversation, or it's only fun if we're fighting and trying to win. So if we start that with our children, of course they grow up thinking that. So I really think for years we've been getting to this point. However, there's a lot that contributes to it. Social media, certainly, we now have access to information, and access to people from all over the world that we simply didn't before. So we're engaging in conversations that we wouldn't have engaged in 20, 30 years ago, because we can speak with somebody across the country or in a completely different part of the country than us that we probably wouldn't have had that conversation with before, which I think can be a really good thing. It's just a matter of how we're doing it.
So you brought it up, and let's get right into it. Today is a day that we have a lot of family around the table. We're having big family get-togethers. What can we do to speak to have these conversations with people who have opposing views across this table and still keep it civil?
Yes. So I think today's an opportunity. So, I hope for some of your viewers they are able to utilize it as that. But of course, some of these tips or these ideas go well beyond just the holiday table today, and hopefully become a part of people's lives. But the first thing that just to share, I think, is we have to get rid of this very contentious notion of right versus wrong. And so, what I mean by that is, I think when we create our political views, we've done a lot of research, we've done a lot of thinking about why we've come to these views, why we feel the way we feel. And so, because we've put thought into that and research into that, obviously we feel that we are right in our views, and that's okay. But what that means is that we automatically assume that anyone who doesn't agree with us, well, if we're right, they must be wrong. And so that is very contentious. And we need to get rid of that notion of right versus wrong and have more of a conversation, more of a dialogue about here's what I believe, here's what I think and why. And then, tell me a little bit about what you think that's different than that. Try to learn from them instead of just loading up and attacking them for not thinking exactly the way that you do.
Are there any other tips that you would suggest from y'all's research that would be able to help us have that conversation?
Absolutely. So this one is just a golden rule of communication, and it sounds so simple, but it's to listen. It's to listen to the other person. Now, when I say that, people often either kind of like, oh yeah, listen, I get it, or they go, yeah, of course, listening is important. But I want to take it a step further. When we listen to other people that we disagree with, what we tend to think that means is simply being quiet and not interrupting them. And while that's a good start, that's really not listening. Because when we do that, we're showing the respect of not interrupting, but we're probably reloading our own thoughts and our argument that we want to present next in our head. And so if we're doing that, if we're just focused the entire time on reloading our own thoughts to argue with the other person while they're talking, we're not really hearing what they're saying. And so the harder thing to do, but the more effective thing to do, is kind of take that time to listen, challenge yourself to even repeat back what you heard the other person say. That doesn't mean that you agree with it. So it doesn't mean you have to say, I completely agree with you and here's what you said, but just demonstrating, I heard you, I took the time to listen. It'll help the other person feel like they, one, have been heard and they don't need to interrupt you, but they'll also be more likely to then hear what you need to say in return.
Well, let's get some of our callers involved in this conversation. We want to open up the phone lines. We're going to do regional lines today, which means that if you are in the Eastern or Central time zone, we want you to call 202-748-8000. If you're in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, we want you to call in at 202-748-8001. And keep in mind, you can always reach us on social media, on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ, and on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN. Let's go to our first caller, who is Janaeus Roberts from Vail, Arizona. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, world. Good morning, and Merry Christmas to the world, let's say, because we all got to get along. Yeah, I'm Genius Robert, Vail, Arizona. What I'd like to point out is how unfair the Americans were treated by Europeans, and that started the whole back problem of what we actually live with today. And I will call it this here as a narrative. You can describe it as them and us. That started the whole problem. When you divide people between them and us, you don't give people a chance to even communicate, what happened to them people? They're gone. 97% of them people are gone. They're diminishing. They've got diabetes. Their eyesight's gone. And what I'd like to point out is how this country was actually evolved, how it evolved, okay? And it evolved from a lot of cruelty. And I just want to point out the truth. And
How do we get away from the them and us conversations, Ashley?
Yeah, I think that that is again going back to that contentious notion of creating a if you're not with me, you're against me idea. And so one of the things that I think is really important there is one, not to label people as not, if you're not with me, you're against me. Two, to really hear them, kind of hear their point of view. And then three, and almost most importantly, is try to understand where you might share common ground with someone who's very, very different than you or comes from a different place than you. And that can be really hard to find and seek out. However, if it is there, it can be a starting point for healthy dialogue.
Let's go to James, who's calling from Newington, Connecticut. James, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Merry Christmas to everyone there. My point about this is just listening to is not how we got to where we're at, but how before people used to learn how to respect each other. And I'll relate to the fact of Boy Scouts. We had a whole generation of people, including myself, all my brothers, everybody in our neighborhood, who were raised to be kind, obedient, courteous, trustworthy. And when you learned kindness and obedience and respect as part of being that, part of that was you respected other people's views. I think now we're in a society where nobody has been taught these, I dare almost say, morality aspects, and we're trying to pull how to behave without a moral background in order to do that. And that's more like political 70s speak than it is actually being who it is. And I'll just give you one small other thing I noticed. I noticed today, like even on online dating, so many of the women profiles are, don't even talk to me if you supported Trump, or if you're a Republican, forget it. And I have to laugh. For one election, maybe people voted for Obama in the last election. Maybe they voted for Trump in this one, and maybe they're going to vote in the next one for Biden or Muhala, whatever her name, Kavanaugh from California. How can people be so parochial that one opinion matters so much in their lives when we're always evolving as people? So I'll take your call and listen to your response.
Is that a question for me, James?
Yeah, go ahead, Ashley. What do you think about his comment?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that, James. I do think that it's really difficult when people shut off from having a conversation at all with someone who thinks differently than they do. One of the hardest things I think that we try to communicate is that by listening to someone else, and I mentioned this earlier, it does not mean that you agree with them. The whole point of communication, of dialogue, is not to get everybody singing Kumbaya and agreeing with one another. The point is to hear each other and to try to move the needle forward on some issues. And it really is difficult to do that if we have isolated each other from being willing to have conversations, with people. And I think that's happened for a reason. I think those conversations have become heated and frustrated. So I understand that. I understand that people are tired and they're exhausted from the political discourse that's happening every day, the onslaught that's happening. So I do get that. Sometimes you want to shut that out. I do understand. I just know, and at National Conflict Resolution Center, we know that really if you want to affect minds and hearts, if your goal, let's say, is to, take someone who voted differently than you and have them see your perspective, doing it in a way where you've attacked them will likely only entrench them in their views, not help them see your perspective and potentially open their mind. And so really, if the end of your goal, the end of what you're trying to do is to shame someone, that's a very different strategy than maybe trying to convince them or open their heart to what you see.
Ashley, one of our viewers has tweeted in this statement. It is best not to talk about religion or politics in a family gathering or among friends unless you know they agree with you. If not, it can lead to arguments and or anger and make folks feel uncomfortable. If you're hosting that holiday dinner, should you tell your guests we're not going to talk about politics?
Yeah, I know a lot of people who have made this rule. It exists in the workplace, and now it exists kind of in families as well. Every family's different, and the way they communicate is different. The most important thing about today being Christmas or any holiday that you celebrate with your family is that family togetherness. And so I understand families who really want to preserve that. In terms of announcing it to your guests, depending on who's at your table, it could do that opposite effect where if you have someone who really likes the debate and likes the argument, it could make them curious as to why you said that or made that rule, and they might push back, especially if they feel this need to be heard and they want to be heard today. I do think if you are one of those individuals that comes into a conversation and makes themselves heard, understand that this is a day to demonstrate respect to your family, especially if you're a guest at someone's home. It's always good to respect the rules that they've set out. But I encourage people to try to have healthy, civil conversations. If it's not today because you want to just focus on the meal and focus on family time, good, that's okay. But try to have the conversations. They're hard. I do acknowledge that they're hard. But again, what progress are we making if we're not able to do that with one another?
Let's go to Linda, who's calling from Festus, Missouri. Linda, good morning.
Yes, I do have a question. When I was growing up, there was a sort of an unwritten rule in my family that you did not discuss religion or politics at any of our family gatherings because we had a mixture of people who thought that. And everyone was much happier not doing that. We enjoyed each other more. In this day, as I've grown older, I have children, I have grandchildren, what I have noticed is that social media, and I'm not against all social media, but social media, Twitter, Facebook, it enables people to hide behind and say the most atrocious things online, whether it's in the government, whether it's in your family, whether it's your friends, that have broken things apart. And I find that even within my family, when they want to have some kind of a serious discussion, I get it by text message, because when people have to face each other face to face and have a difficult conversation, the outcome seems to me to be better, because you can see the person and the intonation. You can hear that, or even in a phone call, you can hear that, where you don't see it. We don't filter out our tweets, our emails, our things that are on social media. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little. Thank you very much.
That's such a good point. Absolutely. Social media and the fact that we now can email or text in moments has changed everything. I mean, the digital communication world that we live in is very real, and it has changed the way we're having conversations. So there's two sides to this coin. One is that it's reality. If you have grandchildren, if you have children, they're going to text you things that you would rather have a phone call about. Social media isn't going anywhere, and people are going to be engaging in it more and more. So on the one hand, we have to realize that there are ways to communicate digitally that can be very effective. There are ways to demonstrate that you're listening, to acknowledge what the other person is going through or the impact something has had on them. And there are absolutely ways to do that via, social media or written words that you can do in person. I think it's important we focus on that, because that gets to the other side and what you were saying, which is it is a lot easier to take the attack method on social media because we're not face to face. And so and I think people have a lot of bravado across social media. You are hiding behind the computer screen a little bit, and there's a sense of safety there when you're, maybe sitting in your pajamas late at night on your laptop as opposed to face with someone. But that's a little bit of a false notion for us, because in actuality, what we say on social media can live in perpetuity. And so I think we need to be, in many ways, even more careful with the way that we have conflict digitally, because those things stay there for a long time. And if we can demonstrate that we're a level-headed, civil-minded person that's open to dialogue in a way that can be looked back on, I think that speaks volumes for a person.
There are some politicians who've been talking about elevating the political discourse. I want you to listen, Ashley, to a little bit to what outgoing House Speaker Paul Ryan had to say about lifting the political discourse. Here's what he said.
But today, too often, genuine disagreement quickly gives way to intense distrust. We spend far more time trying to convict one another than we do trying to develop our own convictions. Being against someone has more currency than being for anything. And each of us has found ourselves operating on the wrong side of this equation from time to time. And all of this gets amplified by technology, with an incentive structure that preys on people's fears and algorithms that play on anger. Outrage has become a brand. And as with anything that gets marketed, it gets scaled up. It becomes more industrialized, more cold, more unfeeling. And that's the thing. For all the noise, there is actually less passion, less energy. We sort of default to lazy litmus tests and shop-worn denunciations. It's just emotional pablum fed through a trough of outrage. It's exhausting. It saps meaning from our politics. And it discourages good people from pursuing public service.
Do politicians have any responsibility in changing the political discourse that we're having among citizens?
Absolutely, they do. Politicians, set the stage for us. They're who we watch so much of the time. So certainly, I think politicians have a responsibility to demonstrate that they very literally, their job is to work together and to have disagreements and keep the country moving forward. So they do. I appreciate that he acknowledged that we all have those moments where we are not good at this. I work at the National Conflict Resolution Center, and I myself have had those moments where I just get a little bit entrenched in what I'm thinking. And so, no one's immune to that, but if we're aware of it and honestly working on it, I do think a lot of what he said is correct. We get so caught up in the noise of the conflict that we forget that there are actual issues there that need to be resolved.
Let's go to Joe, who's calling from Galveston, Texas. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, and thanks for C-SPAN. Actually, one of the things that I was, watching over a period of time, how things have changed and how it affects the discourse and on the conversations that happen with families, is this error by omission. Where everybody comes in with part of the story, but not the whole story. There are facts, and we try to break these issues down like everything's black and white. And some of these issues are very complicated, and there's a large gray area. And what happens when people come in with just one part that they don't lead to any compromise. When there is a middle ground, a lot of these things that we have a tremendous debate about in our country right now, immigration and a lot of the other issues, there is middle ground, but everybody just comes in with a partial story. And if they're not willing to even look at the middle ground, then the politicians are forced into their sides, and we never reach a compromise. And I'll hang up and I'll let you comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Definitely when you come into a situation assuming you know all sides of the story, I would add to that, assuming you know the values of the person you're speaking with, can be a big mistake in terms of healthy conversation. We do this a lot. We being the collective we, I include myself in sometimes making this mistake. If someone says I'm for or against this, and it's not what I personally am for or against, I assume I know why, right? I assume I know why they feel that way. And so we have to be careful with that. We have to seek from other people, well, why do you feel that way? We have to ask those questions. We're not often interested in knowing that because you feel like, well, why do I care why they're that way? They're wrong, or their opinion is incorrect. The reason that it's important to care why they feel a certain way or why someone else feels a certain way is because without knowing that, it's very difficult to identify the common ground. And the common ground that you share with someone could be the starting point to moving the issue forward. So you look at something like the current, government shutdown and think, okay, so the common ground that may exist there may only be that the government needs to be up and running again, but that is a starting point for people to have conversations. And so getting to that place kind of only happens when you're able to hear from one another why we hold the beliefs that we do.
Let's get one last call in from John from McLean, Virginia. John, good morning. Can you give us a quick question?
Hi, good morning and Merry Christmas. I agree with your assessment with regards to common ground. I certainly agree with Paul Ryan with regards to elevating the discourse. I'm one of those people who enjoys having a political discussion with someone, and it doesn't make any difference to me that we disagree. I certainly tolerate their point of view and the reasons that they're using to defend their point of view and why we should take that policy position or another policy position. It takes tolerance and critical thinking, and I'm looking for your comments on this. It takes tolerance and critical thinking, a combination of both, when you're having a discussion with someone. Most people are talking ideology and ideals, and they're not talking pragmatism. I think it all comes down to a technical issue with regards to how we use language and how we discuss things. I think that too much of our discussions revolve around illogical syllogisms, logical fallacies, and certainly the major media outlets contribute to the spreading of those logical fallacies. So could you talk to me about the technical side of this and how we debate these policy issues?
We do a lot of training at the National Conflict Resolution Center, and one of the workshops that we do really looks at different communication styles. And I think it's important to acknowledge that some people have communication styles that are more emotional. Others have communication styles that are more pragmatic, less emotional. Some people are direct, others are indirect. And none of those communication styles is right or wrong. So what happens often, though, is when someone with a very direct, emotional communication style meets someone with a very indirect, reserved communication style, there's a big misunderstanding in terms of where they're coming from. And so someone may be accused of being illogical and irrational. Another person may be accused of being robotic and uncaring, when actually we are all just fine in our communication styles if we know how to engage with other people who have different ones, right? So yes, there is an element to debate and to dialogue that requires level-headedness. I think calmness. All communication styles can agree that, entering into a healthy conversation requires some calm. Also acknowledging that people can process things differently, and that's okay as long as we're really respecting one another.
Well, we would like to thank Ashley Virtue of the National Conflict Resolution Center for being here today for a very calm and informative conversation about conversations. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Coming up next, this day 3 of Washington Journal's week-long author series, 7 days of what we think were the most important books of the year. After the break, we'll talk to Juan Williams, author and Fox News political analyst, on his latest book, What the Hell Do You Have to Lose? Trump's War on Civil Rights. We'll be right back.
Sunday on Q&A.
Okay, so we are on the floor of the